I became a boat captain in the Delta because when I went down there,
Yeah.
the lieutenant that was head of the river division I went to on a temporary duty came up to me and he asked me, "Hey, son, have you ever driven a boat before?" And kind of kiddingly, I went, "Hey, I'm from Miami." And he went, "Good, you're a boat captain."
What was your rank at that time?
I was an E4. On certain boats, like on Swift boats, I think they had an officer on there actually, but there weren't many Swift boats on the river. They were mostly in Operation Market Time, which was from the coast to two miles out. And then the rest of it, the Riverine Warfare Unit, was from the coastline in. And most of those boats, we never saw an officer on the river, very rare. Most of the boats were E5s and E6s. But I was on a Mike 8 boat, and we were running supplies up and down to the Cambodian border from Saigon and from Na Bay. And so I was just an E4, and I was the senior guy on my boat, and I was the oldest guy at 20.
So the primary mission of the boat that you're on in the Delta then is to bring supplies from Saigon to forces out by the Cambodian border?
Exactly, all up and down. It was called Operation Giant Slingshot. And if you look at a map of Vietnam, there's a piece of Cambodia that sticks into it called the Parrot's Beak.
Right.
And there are two rivers that go around that Parrot's Beak, the Vam Cote and the Vam Co Dong rivers. And that's where I went out of Na Bay, which is a base about 10 miles outside of Saigon. And we were running either troops or equipment or supplies up to the advanced tactical support bases. And that was basically our job.
And are these troops US and ARVN or only US?
No, I only carried US troops. There were a couple of observers and trainees of South Vietnamese Army, but I carried Army troops. There,
Okay,
there were very few Marines down there. There was mostly Army.
sure.
And I carried them, and I carried Seabees that were involved in a half-ass operation where somebody decided they were going to start at the Cambodian border and try to clear the rivers 50 feet on each side of the jungle so that we wouldn't be subject to these ambushes all the time. But as fast as they would knock all that jungle down, it would grow back right behind them. So they abandoned that after about 3 weeks.
I want to ask you about that, but and I don't want to sound like I'm advocating the use of Agent Orange, but Agent Orange was being used. So why would
Right.
they use Agent Orange for that purpose instead
I
of,
have no idea how they made their decisions as to where they used that. I think they used it mostly on infiltration points and enemy supply routes is where they used it mostly, and in the Rungsat Special Zone where the SEALs operated. And they thought that by chemically defoliating the area, that would give less hiding space to the enemy. I guess that was the objective.
yeah,
But
but
they just defoliated the country, is what they did,
right.
and made a
But
lot of men sick.
but it sounds like they wanted to defoliate along the river to prevent ambushes.
Yeah,
In
well,
that case, they decided not to use the,
at Operation Giant Slingshot, they decided to do it manually, and we were carrying in our boats. We had bulldozers and CBs and things like that in there, and offloaded them. And that's where that incident happened that you saw, where the guy walked off the boat and got blown up by a
yeah. Well,
booby
I
trap.
mean, since we're there, I just want to, and the point here is not to get into the gore of what you saw. What I'm interested in is, to the extent possible, you can explain um, just kind of your own psychological state and reaction after this. But so you you're talking about you're bringing these CBs into this area near the Cambodian border, and the goal is to uh, get the bush to cut it back from the side
Right.
of the river so that they can't ambush you as easily. And so you watch as these CBs then step off the boat, and here's what you write. The second man, so this is the second CB, off the boat, stepped about 10 feet into the jungle and hit a tripwire. A small explosion went off, and I watched, disbelieving, as the man's head disappeared from his body and a column of blood spurted straight up into the air. So in terms of what you saw, you've just described it. So I don't want to ask you about that. But I'm interested in, if you could just describe yourself, almost, if I'm sure you can, you can bring that image right back to your mind. And you could even, and so I guess I'm asking you to kind of freeze yourself there and then to step outside yourself and describe yourself in that moment when you're seeing this.
I would imagine in everyone's life they come across instances a few times where their eyes see something that their brain doesn't register immediately. And normally it takes, I think I read 120 milliseconds for the brain to register what the eye sees. But sometimes there's a delay in that when you just can't wrap your head around what your eyes saw. When you see something like that, that's not an everyday or even every life occurrence, there's a lag between the time your eye sees it and the time your brain registers what actually happened. And during that lag, there's nothing in your brain. It's like a void. And it's like, and then, maybe 2, 3 seconds goes by, and then your brain goes, what the hell did I just see? And then you realize that the reality of the situation, that it's real, and there's different ways to react. I turned around, I threw up, you know? I mean, there's times your body reacts to certain stimuli from outside that you just don't get, or you don't even realize. Like that first time we were ever ambushed. We were ambushed and we started shooting. It was the first time in my life anyone had ever tried to kill me. All right. I mean, that never happened to me before. And we were cruising down the river, and all of a sudden we get ambushed, and bullets start flying, and you react. I put the boat in all ahead full, and we got out of there. And then we realized out of our 4 crew members, when we got out of fire zone, that 2 of us had wet our pants without even knowing it. You don't realize that what effect danger or fear or whatever it is or surprise has on your bladder. It's a kind of bizarre thing. And it happened that first time, and unknowingly, you don't even realize it. And sometimes your body plays tricks on you, like that same thing, getting back to the initial question, that your eye sees something that your brain doesn't immediately register, and there's a void time.
Let
But
me,
that is the only way I could explain it.
I want to ask a question about something you just said, and then go back to this incident we were talking about. So first firefight, 4 guys on the boat, 2 of them in the course of the firefight wet their pants.
Right.
Um, I've talked with other vets who have a similar experience. What I've heard from them was, you realize, after the thing passes, you realize what happened. You know, if you're in normal life and that happens and other people know, then that's an embarrassing thing. What I've heard from combat vets, though, in that situation, there's just kind of an understanding and folks let it go, and it's not
No
really.
one said anything about it.
Yeah,
No one brought it up. It was like it didn't happen. We just moved on and continued on our way on the river.
yeah.
But the first time we ever got ambushed was by rocket fire, and I didn't know what it was. Immediately, cruising down the river, our first trip out, I see a puff of white smoke. Something flies across the bow of our boat, explodes on the other side. My immediate thought was, what the hell was that? And then it happened again. And it just so happened that John, our engineman, was sitting right in front of the pilot house there, smoking a bowl of weed. And I lean over and I go, John, what the hell was that? And he just looked up, kind of like, and went, it's the fucking war, man. And then we all just reacted like we were trained. Well, you were in the Navy. We weren't really trained in combat ever. I never got any formal training. They never even showed us how to use those 50 caliber guns that were on our boat. We had a manual and we just had to learn how to use it. We did go before going to Vietnam and right after SEER training, we were sent to Camp Pendleton for small arms training to learn how to use an M16. But that was the extent of our war training. We were never given any battle tactics or riverine warfare tactics or anything like that. It was like on the job training.
They put you on a river, and where you are in the Delta, I mean, there's no question that you're going to get into firefights, but you never had any actual training with a 50 cal.
No, they showed us how to load it. And then when I got two crew members on there that were supposed to be the gunners, I had them read the manual. And I said, you better learn how to use this because that's your GQ station. So they went, before we ever went out, they went through drills and they loaded it and they learned about the timing by turning the barrel on a 50 and what the spacing was supposed to be and all that and how to clean it. And then what we did was, normally a link belt on a 50 caliber holds about 100 rounds. Well, they linked together about 10 of those so that they wouldn't have to reload. And we got a bigger ammo box. And we did the same thing with the M60. We linked belts together to make longer belts so that you wouldn't have to reload. And like I said, it was like on the job training and what you hear from some of the other boat captains that you conversed with, little tricks of the trade, so to speak. And that's how you learned stuff over there. It wasn't like there was any formal training exercises. And you learned to drive a boat by the guy who you were taking over his boat. They'd put you on there a day before, and he'd say, this is how it operates. This is what you do. I'd never driven a 70-foot boat before with 4 engines before they put me on that Mike 8 boat. I didn't know how the ramp worked. I didn't know any of that. I asked the guy where the key was. He looked at me like I was an idiot. There's no keys on those boats. It's just a little rubber button that you push.
This is unbelievable. I I want to come back and ask about this, but to go back to where we were a minute ago. So the CB walks off the boat, hits the tripwire. What you write happens. You describe yourself. You're there, kind of.
Right. Bear in mind, I was on the stern. The pilot house on a Mike 8 is on the stern. And the front of the boat, the bow was on whatever you call a beach, really. It wasn't really a beach, but the side of the river where we dropped the 7-ton front door there. And I watched from there. So I was about 70, 80, 90 feet away from where this happened,
Right.
maybe 100 feet.
So you described yourself in that first, those first seconds. What happens in the next couple minutes as the other guys on the boat are reacting? So, I mean,
Well, they went
what
and
was
got the guy. They
yeah,
went to see. I mean, they didn't know immediately that this guy's most of his head had been blown away. There was just a lot of blood around, and the rest of the Seabees ran out there. I couldn't go out there. I was driving the boat and keeping the boat steady on the shore. And I don't know that any of my other crews saw what happened. I know a few of the Seabees did because they immediately ran out there and pulled back this guy and brought him back on the boat and wrapped him up in a plastic liner. And then, well, actually, they didn't bring him immediately back to the boat because they had to unload their equipment first. We had a tractor on there that they were going to, a bulldozer that they were taking off the boat and that they were going to use to clear some of that vegetation away. And the other boat with us had another bulldozer on it. And these guys were offloading that. And then they continued on with their job. They unloaded it. They started doing what they were doing. And my job was just to keep moving my boat down the river as they progressed. And then at the end of the day, they set up a camp and we stayed there for the night and then continued this for about a week. until they decided this was fruitless. And then whoever was the commander there, they had a CB commander. He just let him know that, this isn't going to work. But they kept us there for a little while longer, another week or so. And we stayed there and kept doing it. And it was fruitless. It was. The Agent Orange was a semi-permanent thing, but knocking down trees in the jungle isn't a permanent thing. It doesn't denigrate the ground where nothing else is going to grow there again.
So this guy, I mean, what happens to the CB? It sounds like that's kind of that slows things down briefly,
Right.
but the mission just continues. You just keep going.
Yeah, well, we were out in the middle of nowhere. There wasn't much we could do. They eventually called in a helicopter that, medevaced him out of there. But that took a while for that to show up because we were so far up the river there. We were almost right at the Cambodian border because that's where the Vam Cote and the Vam Kodong end. Well, didn't end, but they went into Cambodia there. And there were big signs there during the day that said, "Do not enter. This is another country. You weren't supposed to go in there." Although we did cross the border on a number of occasions, but usually it was verboten. And they sent a helicopter up, medevac this guy out, and these guys just continued doing what they were doing. On the rivers, you were always defensive, always. We never did any offensive things. We never, on my boat, some boats did, but we never set up ambushes and waited for the enemy. We were running supplies, so we were the ones always being attacked. So we were all 100% of the time on the defense, which is a different experience from many other guys, like grunts in the jungle or Marines or Army guys that set up ambushes or went in looking for the enemy. We never did that. So we never saw who was shooting at us. Very rare. It was a very rare thing that we would take our M16 and line it up on somebody and pull the trigger and see the result of that. We were normally firing into where we thought the shots were coming from in the jungle. And when the firing stopped, we had the luxury of thinking, okay, they either left the area or they're dead. Here's a situation where I learned after the first trip upriver that there's people out there trying to kill me on a daily basis. But we were going out there, and now you had to expect it. And what happened was that your awareness level peaked as a human being because you had to be aware of everything going on along the riverbank as you passed it. You had to make note of anything that glistened in the sun, anything that was horizontal instead of vertical, any scent of cooking rice or something like that. And you became acutely aware of little things that you may never have noticed before. And that's what it did. It raised your awareness level. And I'm sure that's true with anybody that's ever been in combat, that their awareness level of that circle around them was raised to a peak place that somebody that hasn't experienced combat will never reach that level of awareness. And that's one of the things that stuck with me for the rest of my life. It took me about 3 weeks to realize that it was a waste of time. 3 weeks after I got there, I remember thinking to myself, I says, you know what? I says, what a fucking waste of time this whole thing is, because no matter who wins or loses, it's only going to affect maybe 1 or 2% of the population, because the rest of the population is going to remain a rice farmer or a fisherman for the rest of their lives, no matter what kind of government they have. And the only people that are going to be affected by whether we win or they win or whatever it was, what were the people in power and anybody that had a bunch of money or land. That was it. And I remember reaching that about 3-4 weeks after I got to Vietnam. I didn't express that to anybody. I just thought, I says, geez, what a goddamn waste of time this is. I says, because after I met some of the people and saw what was going on there, but it was solidified once I got down to the river, because once you start traveling up the rivers, those things haven't changed for millennia. I mean, little villages and hamlets but traveling up and down the rivers, I saw that this is like going back in time, just like Joseph Conrad said, in his book. It is. It's like going back in time because vegetation was the king on earth, right? And that's what the jungle was. That's what the rivers were. And I noticed that first when I left Cameron Bay and they sent me down to the river. I flew on like a C-141 or something, and you could look down and see that the farther south you went from Cameron Bay into the Delta, that the rivers looked like just big giant brown snakes surrounded by greenery. And that probably hasn't changed for thousands and thousands of years. And other than in the big cities, which there weren't many at the time in South Vietnam, other than Saigon, other than those cities, nothing has changed on those rivers, even to now. And I realized that when I was there, when I was 20 years old. I said, God damn it, nothing's going to change here. If we win, they win. These people's lives are going to be the same, except there's going to be fewer of them because they're going to die here.
So then, so you have this realization or this thought, but your job puts you in a situation now where you're, as you described it, you never fire first. You're going down the river, you're going to get hit, you just don't know when, and you're going to get hit all the time, and then you fire back, and as you said though, overwhelmingly, you don't even see the people who are shooting at you, you're just shooting back in the general direction. So, I mean, so what do you do in that situation where you're thinking, this project, so to say, is kind of pointless, but and
Yeah,
and
but
possibly the end of my life. So what do you do?
I also realized I'm in a situation that I have very little control over. So all I can do is make the best of it and try to keep me and my crew as safe as possible and try to make it through here.
One of the kinds of missions you write about is inserting and picking up Navy SEALs.
Yeah,
Um,
they had a SEAL team out of Na Bay and they had a boat there. So their leader guy, I would get assigned. I wasn't the only guy that was assigned, but on occasion I was assigned to drive that boat. They would show me a chart of where they were going, and they would tell me exactly when to be ready in the morning to take them and when in the afternoon or early evening to go pick them up at the spot. And when these guys told you to do something, you just did it. There were no questions. You didn't ask why, when, where, nothing. They gave you all the information you needed. And then you just did it. And you didn't ask them any questions after you picked them up. You just brought them back to the base. They went to their own private barracks that they had. I went back to my normal job. That's all I did was drive a boat for them and transport them from A to B and then from B back to A, or sometimes from C back to A, depending on where their extraction point was.
how would you describe these SEALs?
The Viet Cong had a word for them, men with green faces, because they were always, with all that crap on that they put on. But they were very quiet. They didn't talk to me much, other than to say, "This is where we want to go, and make sure you're here at 1800 hours or whatever to pick us up." But I didn't interact with them. They didn't interact with anybody outside their own little group. They didn't tell us what they did, why they did it, who told them to do it, where they did it, who they did it to. None of that. I was not privy to any of that information other than where we were going to be and where they wanted to be picked up. That was pretty much it. There was no, idle chit chat or banter with these guys. They went in, they always came back looking far more haggard than when I dropped them off. There was mud all over them. There was all kinds of crap.
That's one thing I wanted to ask you. I mean, could you just tell by looking at them, not only that they'd gotten dirty from being out in the jungle and sweaty and all that, but were there other things you saw that indicated that they'd gotten into some pretty hairy situations?
Well, yeah, they were out of ammo. A lot of times they came back with very little ammo left. But these guys were all, you could tell who they were on base. They were physically different. They were in extreme shape. They didn't talk to anybody. They had their own table at the EM club that nobody went near, and you just knew who they were. Well, they always wore that little insignia that they have too. So people just, it was like an unwritten rule. You didn't just walk up to these guys and start idle chatter. And they were rotated pretty often. I think it was every 6 months instead of every year, because what they did was very, very intense and constant and a lot of hours. So the mental toll, as well as the physical, which they were trained for, was pretty up there. But like I said, it wasn't like I had any buddies that were SEALs, other than the fact that I was a tool for them. I drove a boat.
Let me read a couple of sentences from your memoir to you, and then if you could just pick up the story.
Right?
Then, bright lights, loud noises, gunfire, an explosion, and screaming. And now I was wet and treading water.
Oh,
The boat's
that's when our
gone.
boat got blown up.
Yeah, the boat's gone somewhere on the bottom of the river where the current's dragging it. I have to swim, but which way, to which shore? It's too dark. I can't see.
Right.
So what is the story of the sinking of the boat?
Well, we took a rocket hit, and the boat started to sink, and the four of us were blown off the boat. There were other boats with us, and for some reason, I went to the wrong side of the river. I was disoriented when I hit. I found out later I had a slight concussion, and I hit the water. I was still wearing boots and my green fatigues and a towel top that we made out of towels, so I was pretty heavy. And I was also familiar with mangroves because we have them here in Florida. And so the rivers aren't that wide, and I'm a really good swimmer, by the way. And I made it to the side of the river, and I knew what I hit was mangroves. And I knew how to try to just slide my body across them instead of trying to climb on them, because then you would get entangled. And I made it up onto onto the side of the jungle there. And then there was still firefight going on out on the river, and they couldn't hear me, of course, and I wasn't going to give away my position. I didn't know where I was. I didn't have any equipment with me, nothing. And I just crawled up. I was all muddy, and I crawled up, and then I heard noises, and then I heard that it was Vietnamese noises, and I covered myself with brush, palm fronds mostly, and I just laid there until the noises were gone, and then I fell asleep. It was night now, and I was exhausted, and I knew that the caked on mud would protect me somewhat from insects and stuff, but I still got bitten up pretty badly. And then I woke up in the morning, sunlight was filtering through the trees, and I looked up, and first I didn't remember where I was exactly until I had a slight concussion. And I woke up, and I decided, well, my best bet is to get back to the river and hope that a boat comes by. And I went back to the river, and I waded out a little bit into the river, and it took about, I was probably there an hour, hour and a half before another boat came by, a PBR came by, and I raised my hands and I yelled in English, and they came in, and it happened to be another boat from Na Bay. And they had sent out people looking for me, actually, because they picked up the rest of my crew. But it wasn't going to do them any good to send them out at night, so they sent out right at the crack of dawn, because we were probably only about 8 or 10 clicks out of Na Bay at the time. And this guy picked me up and gave me some water and some food, took me back to Na Bay. I went to the medical office. That's when I found out I had a concussion. They took me off the river for 2 days and then gave me another boat, sent me back out again. That was pretty much it. It was a pretty harrowing night, but I'm really glad I was able to fall asleep, because then my mind didn't work. Trying to figure out, look at this freaking position that I'm in right now. I mean, I don't, a freaking tiger could come in and eat me. I said, who knows what's out here? There was no rules. That was the thing. It's the first time in your life. Here you are, 18, 19, 20, 22 years old. You normally live within society's norms, and society has rules. And then you're thrust into a situation where there are no rules, where the only rule is whatever particular mores you grew up with. And that takes the forefront. And that's why so many guys, I mean, this is my own theory. That's why so many guys got so screwed up after that war because they couldn't handle not having any rules. And they did things there that later they reflected on, and it was like, well, how the hell could I do that? Or why did I go in that village and just intermittently shoot people? They do it because they knew there would be no repercussions for anything you did. There were no officers out there, on the rivers, on the Navy riverboats, very few. And so whatever you did was kept, you know, among your peer group or your boat crew or whatever. I mean, there were people that got joy out of going down the river and just intermittently shooting people that they saw. And we actually had a discussion about that on my boat. Because on my boat at the time, we had a guy that was from Oklahoma, a farmer. We had another guy from Wisconsin whose father owned a foundry, so he came from a pretty upscale background. And then we had like a semi hoodlum from Chicago that was our engineman, and then me. And we sat around talking one night, and we knew what some of these other guys did because you traveled with other boats sometimes. And we realized the fact, there's no rules here. We can pretty much do whatever we want. If we want to go in and burn down a village, who cares? If we want to go in and rape all the women in the village or kill all the old men or steal all their belongings, you could do that. There weren't going to be any repercussions. So we talked about it, and I'll never forget this kid, Ebel from Oklahoma. He says, I know how we can take care of ourselves. And I go, what's that? He goes, I think we should never do nothing that we don't tell our mama about. And we all laughed at first and then said, that could work. That could work. Because there are certain things guys did that I'm sure they never related to their mother or their father or their sister or their brother. And if that's one of your underlying rules of behavior, that could work. Because most guys, not all, but most guys respect their mother or what their mother knows about them. So that actually worked on our boat. And we never intermittently shot somebody or did anything to anybody that was out of the norm or would have been considered antisocial or illegal back here.
But the reason you had that discussion and that thought process is because that kind of stuff was happening in the Delta.
Sure, it was. It was happening all over the place.
Well, this fits because I've talked to a number of guys in the Delta, and they have different memories, but I have heard from a couple guys who served in the Delta, and they said that at least in parts of the Delta, and it sounds like this would apply to where you were, it really was kind of a Wild West.
It was. Sure, it was. And that was because of the fact that there were no rules. It was There were no societal rules. If you're 18 or 19 years old and you have a machine gun in your hand, you're a pretty powerful guy. You can pretty much get away with whatever you want to do. And especially in a situation where there aren't going to be any repercussions. What's going to happen? Nobody's even going to know about this.
And so you describe a situation where you are in charge of a boat. You're a 20-year-old E4.
Right.
There are no officers around. You guys are out in the river.
That's why I said we make our own rules. Everybody on those boats did.
Yeah.
And some people stuck within the norms of society and some didn't, only because they could.
Yeah, it's the question of, what happens to, here we're talking about young men when they are far from home, far, if they went to church or synagogue, far from the church or synagogue they grew up in, far from their teachers, radically different environment, in a combat environment, the endless stress of that environment. And, what happens to these guys, right, in that context? And
Right? It
it's
depends on how they
super.
were brought up and what their belief systems are.
Speaking of kind of a Wild West environment, there's a story you relate in your memoir of a South Vietnamese guy, um, who's with you, and if I remember the story correctly, there's a Viet Cong sniper who takes
Right.
shots at the
That
boat, and
that was the guy put on our boat during the Actov. When the US was winding down being there, they, in the latter part of 1969 and 70, what they were doing was turning over and training the South Vietnamese. It was called the Actov program, accelerated turnover to the Vietnamese.
right,
So they gave us a guy on our boat that was eventually, because we didn't take any of that stuff home with us. We left all those boats and everything there. So they were going to eventually take them over. So I had this guy as a ride along, like cops would do. They have a ride along, right? But he was a different kind of guy. He was a very strange guy. But we were riding down a river. We got ambushed by a sniper. And it happened to be, you know what an oxbow is? Like almost like a half a U-turn, you know, in the river. So he hit us at one side of it. And when we went completely around, we were still near the guy. We knew where he was. And one of our rules was you don't ever leave the boat. You don't bring the boat up, on the rivers. It's like an unwritten rule, but you just never did that. But this guy says, I want to get this guy. And for some reason, like we did a lot of times on my boat, we were kind of democratic and we voted on a lot of stuff. We decided, okay, let this guy do it. And so I pulled the boat in. Crew member tied us to a tree. This guy jumped off the boat. I followed him because I figured if he's going to capture a guy, I was in the Navy and how to tie knots. I can handcuff this guy with a rope. I followed him through the river or through the jungle. I come to a clearing about maybe 3 to 4 minutes after I left the boat. And this guy already captured this guy coming down from the tree, he said. And I walk into a scene, a little tableau there of this guy down on his knees with his hands behind his head like this. And the other guy, the guy from my boat, is holding a gun at his head. And they're looking at each other with hate. And then I see the guy with the gun, he moves in front of the guy and points the bottom of his foot at this guy's face, which I had no idea at the time what that meant. And then I get my rope out and I'm going to do it. And all of a sudden, this guy goes back around and pulls the trigger and blows this guy's head away. And that was another one of those places where your eyes see something, but your brain doesn't register what happened. And my mouth just dropped open. I go, what the fuck? I said, what the hell? And I look at him and he looks at me. I couldn't say anything. He didn't say anything. He just started walking back to the boat. So I went back to the boat, never said a word to the guy, never said a word to me. And it was all just that picture was just right there, right there. I go, how could this guy do that? It's something that was alien. I was ready to tie this guy up, take him in as a prisoner, turn him over to the authorities. That's all. And then, so that's another thing. You capture a guy, turn him to the authorities, you walk away without thinking, what are they going to do to this guy? But it never came up. Although when we got back to the base, I said, I want this guy off my boat, and I don't want him on my boat. Get him out of here. I didn't explain why. I never told anybody why. I had witnessed murder. I mean, that was just murder. That wasn't killing. That was murder. Somehow I justified a difference between the two at the time. But that was just a really bizarre situation that I've never seen anything like it since or before in my life. I got my go home orders. I was still out on the boat. So there was only like a 36-hour span between the time I was in the jungle and I was in Seattle, Washington. And I didn't even have time to change. They got me a flight out of there. I had time to pack my sea bag, and I was still in fatigues when I flew on a commercial flight that made a stop in Hawaii, where the captain of the plane, the plane pilot, let me use their lounge to go in and shower and change into civilian clothes. And then landed in Seattle, and they picked me up and took me to whatever base it was. But I mean that was like 36 hours from the time in the jungle till the time I landed in the United States again. It was pretty bizarre because they just came in, and I just come in off the river, and they went, "You're out of here. Go pack. Boom, you got orders out." And I was gone.
And within one day of being back in Seattle, you were a civilian?
I was back in Miami the next day.
So it sounds like, what, 3 or 4 days, you're on a boat in the Mekong
And my parents were picking me up at the airport at Miami International.
in less than a week.
Yeah, in like, well, 3 days.